very warm welcome to everyone who's logged in. I'm Naina. I'm an executive committee member of NPPA. And on behalf of Team NPPA, I welcome you all to this keynote address on the topic diagnosing, nurturing, and maintaining resilience, tools for positive development in stressed environments. The speaker for this session is Professor Michael Ungar. Professor Ungar is a family therapist and professor of social work at Dalhousie University, where he holds a prestigious national research chair in child, family, and community resilience. His research on resilience around the world and across cultures has made him the #1 ranked scholar in his field, with numerous businesses, educational institutions, government agencies, and not for profits relying on his research and clinical work to guide their approaches to nurturing individual, organizational, and community resilience. He is the author of 18 books for parents, educators, mental health professionals, and employers, including his most recent works, Change Your World, The Science of Resilience, and The True Path to Success, which is a book for adults experiencing challenges at work and at home, working with children and youth with complex needs, 20 Skills to Build Resilience, a book for mental health professionals, and I Still Love You, 9 Things Troubled kids need from their parents, and accessible guides for parents seeking to build their children's resilience. Professor Ungar has received numerous awards for his scholarship and contributions to his community, including the Canadian Association of Social Workers National Distinguished Service Award, and has been named a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Professor Ungar routinely appears in all forms of media and maintains a blog titled Nurturing Resilience on Psychology Today's website. Thank you so much, sir, for being here with us. I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce the chair for this session, which is Professor Amrita Deb. Professor Deb is an associate professor of psychology in the Department of Liberal Arts at the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad, India. Professor Deb conducts research in the area of psychological resilience and well-being. She is specifically interested in the risk and protective factors that stem from individual, social, and cultural components. Some of these research investigations have been funded by the Indian Council of Medical Research and Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute. Through her work, she attempts to identify the wide range of positive outcomes in the aftermath of adversities such as childhood trauma and mental illness. Professor Deb is also currently serving as the Vice President of Resilio, the International Association for the Promotion and Dissemination of Research on Resilience. In addition to this, she teaches courses on positive psychology and psychological resilience, which covers the history and background of positive psychology and resilience research and their applicability in the contemporary world. We welcome you, Professor Deb, and I kindly request you to take over.
Thank you very much, Nena. So also thank you for the introduction to the keynote speaker. I thank NPPA for inviting me to chair this session in the 3rd International Conference on Positive Psychology. And I'm very happy to welcome Professor Ungar today. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Those working in the area of resilience are already familiar with Professor Ungar's work. And on behalf of them, let me take the liberty of telling you that we thoroughly enjoy your talks as well. The audience may share their questions or comments on the chat box, and we will discuss these after the talk. I now invite Professor Ungar to present his talk.
Well, Dr. Deb, so nice to see you again. It's always a pleasure to interact with my colleagues in India. Even at a distance here in Canada. Thank you very, very much for this honor to present today. I'm going to share a screen just to bring you into the conversation about resilience that I'm sort of beginning to sort of take on. I will bring this up. Oops. Sorry, I needed to go to there. And I'm hoping, Dr. Deb, you can see that screen. All is good technically. We are good to go. So what I'd like to do just with in this hour is to provide you perhaps a little bit of an introduction into some of the emerging science of resilience, as well as what that science actually means in terms of clinical applications, because of course this is an applied science. Let me begin though, before I get into the science a little bit, let me begin by where the inspiration for my work sort of comes from. It's more specifically the people that I've actually worked with. A little while ago, I was actually working with a young woman. She was about in her mid-20s, and she was coming to see me at a clinic that I worked at, and she was in an abusive relationship. She was herself a young professional. She'd gone to university, and she was actually working as a paralegal in a legal office. And it was interesting. I'm a social worker. You've got me today. I'm in a suit. I'm not often in a suit. I'm very casual in my work. And this young woman, though, every time she'd come to see me, she would come on her lunch hour from the office down the street, and she would always be dressed extremely nice, like very fitted blouse and very, very special jewelry and a skirt. I had to ask my wife what you call it. I think you call it a pencil skirt or something like that. Very office, very, 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 very formal office, lawyerly kind of identity. Anyways, she told me a story about how she'd met this man at a bar, and they eventually moved in together in a big city. And he had become very emotionally threatening, abusive. He didn't pay any rent. He was unemployed. He would never cook. He would mess up the apartment, even though she was paying the rent from her salary. And she told this awful story of being trapped in this emotionally and potentially physically violent relationship. And even though I couldn't quite understand why she just didn't leave, it became apparent that she was really stuck there. Now, we spent many weeks working together to see if I could promote a change of mindset, a certain self-worth, a sense of her, looking at some of the earlier experiences with her own family that made her vulnerable to this kind of emotionally abusive relationship. But nothing really worked. I wasn't able to move her along. And then one day, I had a very funny idea. I said to her, I'm just curious. Like, I look at you and I see a woman who is so professional and powerful in how she presents herself. And I'm curious, well, what happens to make that transformation to the woman who is being abused at home? And you might guess that as I asked her about her routine, what quickly became apparent was that when she got home, the very first thing that she did was that she changed her clothing. She put her very fine clothing onto hangers, and she put on a pair of sweatpants and a sweatshirt and made herself very small, very unimpressive. So I had a little experiment. I said to her, I don't know if this will work, but please, I'm curious to see what would happen. When you go home this week for one day, would you please not change your clothes? And she did. She went home. She didn't change her clothes. She went into the kitchen. Her boyfriend was telling her to go get him some food or a beer or whatever. But now she was dressed like the lawyer the paralegal that she was. She came back a week later and everything had changed. She said, and I have talked to a good friend of mine who's going to help me move out. My lease on my apartment comes up in about 6 weeks. I'm going to leave. I'm not going to tell him I'm leaving. I'm just going to simply one day pick up and take all my stuff and get out of this relationship. Now, there were other factors, perhaps. She had a safety plan. She had friends. She had a place to go. But I'm going to argue that one of the catalysts for that was the change in her dress. She could not, in that uniform of the office, be the abused woman that she was at home. The two identities clashed, but those identities are not just in the mind. I'm going to argue that they are cued to us. They are triggered by the external environment. So what I'm actually going to come bring you here today is this idea that our resilience is more than just sort of an individual set of cognitions. I'm going to argue it is much more about also the resources and the environments around us. And in fact, the way I think about resilience is very much in terms of three columns. I think about first, what is the risks that I'm exposed to? What is the desired outcomes I'm trying to achieve? And then that tells me what is the right protective processes at which systemic level is actually going to be the most important. Now, I kind of get at this that I'm going to argue that there are multiple protective factors, whether they are cognitive, whether they are biological, whether they are environmental, whether they are social, that all of them have to respond well to the very specific risk profile. In that case, this young woman had a certain history of abuse and perception of her role as a young woman, a social construction of that identity. And the outcome of her safety and sort of self-esteem and a loving relationship, it was really about giving her the right identity. And that identity was wrapped up in a sense, her professionalism and her clothing and the way that she interacted with the world. I'm going to argue that when we can actually now diagnose resilience. This might seem sort of odd, and I'm actually still to this day quite amazed that this ever got published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. But I argued that we could actually diagnose resilience just like we diagnose a disorder. As long as we started first, of course, in terms of any differential diagnosis, you would start perhaps with saying, well, what is the adversity that someone is being exposed to? What's the severity of it? What is the chronicity of it? Is it at, just an individual level, or is it also tied up in one's, well, gender or social location, poverty, racism? Is it tied up to your community, your caste, what levels are we talking about in terms of where does that risk, adversity come from? And of course, there's that attributions of causality. Do you blame yourself? How do you appraise your situation, which is obviously reflective of Raphael Kalesch's work out of Germany. And we would also talk about cultural or contextual relevance of the different adversities that you're experiencing. Now, if you can handle all that and think, oh my gosh, I have to think about that young woman. What kind of violence was she being exposed to emotionally or potentially physically? What was her dangers? What kind of resources did she have? Then generally speaking, we know that when people are exposed to low levels of risk, they can kind of focus in on their own individual cognitions. But if risk is much higher, I'm going to argue that we also have to pay attention to the availability of external resources. Do you have a place to go? Do you have housing? Do you have a friend who can actually help you leave an abusive relationship? And are those resources accessible? When you reach out to them, do people reject you or tell you, no, you should just stay with this abusive man? And of course, can you use your resources strategically? Can you make them? Can they actually help you to get what you need? And does the world around you tell you that your strategies for coping? So did the world around her, imagine her mother had told her, well, he seems like a nice guy. You should really stay with him. And you have had several other boyfriends and none of them have worked out. So it's you who are the problem. And if you can imagine that kind of negative reinforcement versus a friend saying, honey, you deserve better. So this kind of notion of the external resources affect us, as well as what's the capacity of our environment to allow us to change. Did she have a place to go? Did she have the money to change her life? And did she actually need, or was she in fact trapped by the abusive situation? So there's also elements of social and historical significance. Let's face it, who is in political power is going to influence the policies, the resources, the social programs, the tone around, whether it's around tolerance, whether it's around a very collectivist identity. As I'm speaking to you today from Canada, you may be aware that we're having a little bit of a fight right now with our southern neighbor who's acting a little bit like a very, very, very bad neighbor. And so in a sense, we have this kind of different periods of time affect us psychologically. And of course, our own personal development, and there's of course cultural factors as well, which makes obvious sense, especially in a country as diverse in terms of its cultural heritage and the multiple linguistic groups and cultural groups as India is very proud, I know, to have. Now, my point of all this is to kind of make the point that, look, I'm going to argue that our focus has to be a little bit more contextual. This is I worked with Angela Ariona from one of a postdoc who worked with me. She was from Spain, and we asked a rather provocative question. We certainly wanted to know, for instance, do mindfulness-based programs for children actually work? And we looked at we did this major sort of meta-analysis of the published studies. And, the good news is that, yes, generally speaking, those studies have a net positive effect. So what we can say is that if you have an intervention like mindfulness, and we just heard something about that from Dr. Narendra just before this talk, we would say that there's a positive net effect of that possibility. But then we asked, because we're resilience scholars, we asked the second question. And the second question was, at what level of risk exposure do these programs work the best? And what we actually found was that most of the variance to the positive change, could be accounted for by studies with children or by interventions with children who were at higher levels of risk. In other words, meditative processes, if one thinks about it, are going to have the most profound impact when you're under the most stress. But they have very little impact, it seems, on children who already have good environments that are sustaining them, that are already teaching them, self-regulation. So if you're a parent and you already, as your child is you're out shopping with them or something, and they interrupt a couple of adults speaking, and the adults are speaking. Now you listen, that's not very polite to interrupt. And you have taught a little bit of self-regulation. The idea that the child needs a formal intervention is probably overstated. There's probably not a lot of economic or social benefit to actually teaching that child as long as they are not in a crisis. Now, we could argue it's a nice thing to have and it's non-stigmatizing to teach all children. But my point is that there is a dynamic in the resilience literature that says what is the most effective intervention is always related back to the risk that we expose to. Now, even like, John Kabat-Zinn, who's talked about mindfulness, who's adapted mindfulness-based practices to Western contexts, has said, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. But from a risk point of view, from understanding resilience as a more dynamic concept, I would argue that it's a lot easier to learn to surf if you have a surfboard, a coach, and a lifeguard. So thus, the conversation now about resilience is, as much as maybe we want to look like this and calm and blissful, or maybe aspire to be absolutely enlightened like a monk, I would argue that we forget that that monk is not there alone. Embedded in a community, embedded in a village, having children, raising crops, turning crops into food, and feeding their spiritual leader becomes part of the story of individual grit, individual capacity to cope. We are not alone in our minds. We are both psychologically robust, but also resourced or need to be resourced by the world which is around us. And all of this, I have to say, begins to sort of take us into that direction of being both of very sort of rugged individuals when problems are few, or having multiple resources as problems become far more complex. Now, this is really where the science, I think, is going. We are not necessarily just talking about individual responsibility for resilience anymore. We are now talking about that individual responsibility having to also be resourced with things around us. So perhaps a definition of resilience that my research group we often use is when you're exposed to unusual stress, it seems like our resilience is our ability, alone or potentially in groups, to navigate or to make our way to all the psychological, the social, the cultural, the physical resources we need to do well. But it's also about our ability to negotiate or ask for those things to be given to us in ways that we experience as meaningful. And if you think about Steger's work or others who are sort of presenting at this conference, meaning making, of course, is part and parcel of this incredibly important pathway to resilience. But first and foremost, let's not misunderstand. To be resilient, to experience resilience, I need to be able to find my way to the supports I need, or at least the cognitions that are going to help me when my stress level is elevating, is getting higher. And of course, I need to be able to ask for the things I need. Imagine I had said to that young woman who was not leaving that relationship, I don't know, maybe, just leaving her without, when she made the decision to leave, imagine we had just said, well, just think positively and you'll get yourself out of this very violent situation. Positive thinking was part of her change of behavior, but then she also had a very big friend come over and help her move her furniture out of the apartment and ensure that she would not be abused when she was doing that. So there's always an element of giving people both the resources and the rugged qualities that they need to do well. All of this to say then is, one way I can sort of display this is using the story of Cinderella. It's a very funny way of telling a very scientifically grounded story. But if you think about it, the story of Cinderella is always told as a story of resilience. The young girl, of course, her mother died. You know this story as well as we, it's a global story of the mother dies, the father dies, and then she's left with the evil stepmother. Poor stepmothers always get bad. They always are treated very poorly in these stories. And then she grows up, of course, doing very well because there is a fairy godmother who turns a pumpkin into a golden carriage and takes her to the ball. And then she enchants the prince and basically lives happily ever after. I'm going to argue that this story is not about Cinderella at all. This story is misnamed because the story is actually about the power of the fairy godmother. If you take the fairy godmother out of this story, all you have is an abused child growing up in a kingdom that has no social safety net, no social workers, no psychologists, no one to help her deal with an abusive home. And indeed, you would also learn that this girl has no way of getting into the palace because there is no fairy godmother to turn a pumpkin into a golden carriage. And if she is eventually going to get fed up with her abusive mother or stepmother, she is going to run away, like so many children do. And she's going to end up on the street, finding food, perhaps swapping sex for a place to sleep at night, whatever it takes to survive. My argument is that Cinderella the princess or Cinderella the street child, doing whatever she needs to survive, it hinges on the fairy godmother. And therefore, well, coming back to this idea, whatever the risk exposure is, the right protective factor will get us the right desired outcome. And in a sense, don't you feel perhaps that we, as professionals in this field, we are fairy godmothers or fairy godfathers, if you prefer, that we, in a sense, provide one of those protective processes to help people deal with the risks, become more resilient, and achieve the desired outcome they want. Now, all of this is really taking place within a multi-systemic universe of intersecting systems. The psychological, this idea that, by helping people develop better mindset, absolutely predisposes us to being that much more robust, able to cope with stress. But where the science is actually going now is we are also understanding that the psychological exists alongside the biological, that our immune systems influence our susceptibility to things like depression and anxiety. but that also the social environment, the friendship networks that we have, or a teacher who actually notices a student is at risk, or a good friend. All of these social networks actually change our thinking, our conceptions of ourselves. Our identities are not embedded in us biologically. They are actually social constructs. We look out at the world and it tells us who we are. And of course, the built environment, whether or not the quality of our housing, whether or not there was places to buy food, whether or not we have educational institutions to go to, or a safe workplace. These are all aspects of our resilience as well. And of course, the natural environment plays a factor here. And what we're now understanding is that if you are stuck with someone as a psychologist, and if you find that I cannot change this person's mindset, the science is now saying, well, go to another concurrent level. Look at the social environment. And in fact, there's now something called social prescribing. Psychiatrists are now sometimes saying, we will not give you a pharmacological, a pill intervention. We instead are going to offer you a prescription that says, go to a movie with a friend, or do something social with a friend or a family member as a way of alleviating depression. Now, one of the other more specific, I mean, that's a kind of a more broad concept. So what I've actually been doing in my work is trying to understand all these different factors. And when we run studies all over the globe, and many of those are published online, you can certainly find them. But what I'm actually understanding is that there are many external factors that people use to sustain their capacity to cope under adversity. They have relationships with many different kinds of people, not just the primary love interest, or indeed for a child, a primary parent attachment. There's also this idea of a powerful identity and how others know us, as well as, not to mention, that this need for power and control or sense of efficacy. There's also a need for social justice. Can we really talk about people being resilient or showing resilience in conditions where they are being oppressed, where they're being racially or ethnically or socially marginalized? Can we honestly talk about gender-based violence? Can we avoid those conversations and still talk about people changing their mindset? It seems a bit impossible. It's not that we can change all those factors, but we can certainly have conversations with people about these aspects as they appear in their own lives. And of course, there's basic access to material resources, whether it's healthy air or a safe school or a home that's in a neighborhood that also is not dangerous. And then there's ideas about social cohesion and belonging and spirituality and religion and all these other aspects that make us feel like our lives have some bigger meaning. And not surprising, we see in our studies all around the world also an idea of cultural adherence. Now, those are, in a sense, the external resources. Of course, each of those external resources has an internal equivalent. As we just heard in the last presentation, this idea that, that our internal lives are, in a sense, reactions to some of these external elements. Now, because I'm just going to survey this quite quickly, I've written extensively about each of these factors, so that's not my purpose here. My purpose here is more to just introduce some of these ideas. But one of the things we also have is a standardized measure of resilience, in which we've actually authenticated, validated this around the world. There's several versions of this. There's for younger children, there's for adolescents, and there's also for adults. Let me just very quickly run through the questions in the adolescent and young adult. So this is the version of the questionnaire that's ideal for anywhere from about age 13 through to age 24. And there are multiple translations of this around the world, including, I believe, in India as well. And I just want to very quickly sort of entice you into this conversation by showing you this particular measure. So this is the adolescent version. And if you want to think about a young person, either a younger adult, like the young woman I just talked about, or perhaps an adolescent, you can actually perhaps think about how would they answer these questions. It's done on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. We have other ways of doing the assessment with this, but for now, let me use for lower people with lower literacy, we have adaptations of this as well. But in terms of bringing you into the conversation of resilience, I'm just going to read out the 17 questions. Now, it's fun to follow along and think about a young person that you know, and to think, how would they score on this? So, to what extent does the following statements apply to you? I cooperate with people around me. 1, not at all, or 5, yes, a lot, or anywhere in between. Getting an education is important to me, right? Training is a key factor in resilience. And again, with the person saying not at all or a lot. Number 5. I know how to behave in different social situations. So there's that sense of being able to be flexible in how you behave and how you relate to people. My parents are caregivers, really look out for me. So there's a sense that I'm watched and I'm cared for by others. My parents and caregivers also know a lot about me, that people actually, they understand me, they get me, they know what I like and prefer. By the way, these questions were not developed by just me in my head or with a bunch of students sitting in a university in some building in Canada. They were done with communities all around the world on 5 continents. If I keep going, people like to spend time with me, so there's a social desirability factor. I talk to my family about how I feel. There's a sort of a connection around emotions. I feel supported by my friends. Again, those sort of social networks that we know are related to resilience. I feel like I belong in my community, whatever you define as a community, even an online community for many young people. My family stands by me during difficult times. And again, a family can be a street family or it can be a biological family. Number 11, my friends stand by me during difficult times. Again, not at all or a lot. I'm treated fairly in my community. There again is that theme of social justice. I have opportunities to show others that I can act responsibly and basically make a contribution. I feel secure when I'm with my family or my partner if I'm older and have a relationship. I have opportunities to apply my abilities in life, like job skills and caring for others. In other words, people see me as someone who's needed. I enjoy my family's cultural and family traditions, whatever those are. And finally, if I'm hungry, I have enough to eat. And generally speaking, what we find is as you score that out of 85, most people who show an ability to cope with stress tend to score really 65, 70 and above. And if you score someone, below 50 into the 40s, or I had someone just score 17 on this recently, then you begin to know that you see a dramatic amount of risk in their particular lives. I'm not going to go through this, but there's an adult version as well, which these are all open source on my website, and you're very welcome to go take a look. What I'm really getting at here, though, is this idea of the specificity that we can assess resilience as a dynamic model between what people need and what they have. I learned this very vividly in Japan, where you might remember some years ago, there was a major earthquake just off the coast, and then a tsunami and a nuclear disaster. And one of the, along with a colleague of mine, Dr. Keiji Akiyama, I went to one of the communities that had been just devastated. I wanted to just bring you into this idea of what is always thinking about the resilience factors that are embedded locally or culturally relevant. So here we have a town, Yamada, and the wave that came in at 11 meters high, if you can believe this, wipes out the community. And remarkably, many children survived because the schools had alarms, tsunami alarms, and these children were evacuated. But it was many of the adults who died. The town was devastated, and eventually this is kind of what it looked like after the wave retreated. When I got there about 18 months later with my colleague, what we saw was all the debris had been taken away, and we saw places like this. Now, this is not a regular school. In Japanese culture, and in other parts of the world too, a lot of children don't just go to school during the day, they go to after-school preparatory schools. And what the NGOs and the people coming in to prevent trauma in these children did was they set up these after-school schools. Many of the children were living in these small little temporary housing units and were under a lot of stress related to being in a very small space, often with extended family. These after-school schools basically gave the children a chance to leave those homes, to be in a place with other children, so their social networks were enhanced, and indeed, they were basically being shown that they still had a future, that they had an ability to think positively about their future because now they were being treated like normal, quote unquote, Japanese children who go to school and then go into these prep schools in the evenings and on weekends. And I remember seeing this, and after a while, my colleague, he showed me 3 or 4 of these spaces. I said, Kenji, I get it. This is a wonderful Japanese version of trauma-informed care. This is what's important. But then I said, like, what about like soccer balls and play and other things that in my country we would give children if they were traumatized by a natural disaster? And Kenji looks at me very sternly and he says to me, Mike, why would we want our children wasting their time playing? And this, of course, is the basis of more culturally relevant psychology. This idea of what is a protective factor. This is a protective factor, this intense studying to go and play and do things that we in my country would think about as trauma-informed treatment would be seen as somehow superfluous and silly. So what I'm really getting at is I won't give you the instructions, but I will show you this, that what I'm really getting at is as an intervention, we have the ability to actually go into to think about one of our clients, the patients that we're working with. And I'm going to argue that once you get this model of these internalities and these externalities, it opens up a great deal of possibilities for interventions. I gave you 7 different factors that people navigate and negotiate for. But it can get kind of confusing. I mean, the woman that I just talked about or whatever, it can get very complicated when you're working with survivors of a natural disaster and the trauma that they've experienced. So the way I approach this is very much in terms of 3-column thinking. What are the risk factors at multiple levels of a person's life? What is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve in terms of trauma-informed care and psychological well-being, connections to others, stability, that type of thing? And then what is the right set of protective factors in the middle that will allow me to achieve that story? And then what I do, and this I actually use clinically, you can actually use this in a conversation with a client, then what I'm basically doing is connecting lines. So if you have a particular school-based intervention, a child who's very badly traumatized has a teacher, whatever, that risk of past trauma and disconnection will be met very well by a protective factor like stability of education, which achieves the outcome of a child who's better engaged back into a routine, and perhaps in that routine feeling like their world is more predictable and ultimately develops a certain sense of optimism. Now, if you notice, the story I'm telling kind of goes from these risks to these protective factors to the outcomes. And when we get that, we get a really robust story of possibilities, right? The fairy godmother in Cinderella's story is the protective factor, just like you are protective factors for people who are highly dysregulated and maybe need some sort of social and emotional learning opportunity and that type of thing. Now, one of the other ways that I can sort of show you this is that actually from the research, I mean, we do these big multi-million-dollar studies all around the world in which we're looking at all these different systems in a young person's life. Again, this is focused on young people between the ages of 13 and 24. And what we actually did in communities that were highly dependent on oil and gas production, where you have a very volatile world price of oil, that actually, as the world price of oil either, goes up or goes down, you see changes and stressors on the families in communities that rely on that particular industry. And so what we did was we went into places, small communities of say 7,000 to 10,000 people, and we literally surveyed 500 young people. And we said, okay, so Tell us about your personal strengths, your peer supports. We use the CYRM, the measure I just showed you, along with many other measures. And we looked at psychological supports and spirituality or religious affiliations. We looked at education, culture, engagement at work. We wondered about people's perceptions of their neighborhoods as safe or dangerous. We cut some hair to take a biostress marker of hair cortisol, which is a good indicator of the stress levels over the last 3 months that someone has been experiencing. We looked at depression and active living environments. Do you have access to playgrounds and pools and this type of thing, or beaches? And then we also looked at the percentage of green and blue spaces. In other words, are there open green, spaces that are nice natural environments to be in? And when you take all that data, it begins to look like a squishy ball. It's kind of like, oh my gosh, there's all these interactions, right? But if you just took something like depression scores on the children living in these very economically volatile communities, what's interesting is, I won't go into all the math, but just look visually. On the left-hand side of the screen are the young people. They weren't children, they were adolescents and young adults who actually showed clinical levels of depression. And you can see that all of those factors I just talked about are much less tied together. But the young people who were not depressed did not show clinical levels of depression, are on the other side, and very obviously that network is much tighter and much closer, and you get some idea about how it all sort of fits together. I think our job as mental health professionals is to help people sew those themes together and create those networks of factors in their lives. Now, very simply, this is just another sort of variation on that with another sample of youth in a different study in which we are looking at service use experiences. I'm not going to give you all of this just in the interest of time, except to share this. That measure of resilience I just shared with you earlier, what I can tell you is that when we worked again with young people and or young adults, what they told us that when they're under a lot of crises and a lot of stress and needing services and all kinds of problems are in their lives, when they find a service professional like yourselves, like me, who actually allows them to be engaged and tuned in, and it's a positive experience, they actually increase their scores on those 17 questions I just showed you. And that then changes behavioral outcomes. So in other words, we become part of the fairy godparent story here. We provide a service environment that enriches the resilience scores that then changes things like high-risk substance abuse, high-risk sexual activity, dropping out or disengaging from education or work, those kinds of things. So we are a catalyst. We are part of an environment that helps young people raise their scores on many of those particular questions. And if I might, just to sort of cushion this ever so slightly, I also want to make sure that I communicate that there's a little bit of a cautionary note, I also must say. And that is that, everyone is a little bit different. And we're now understanding, this is some of the work I've been doing on what's called differential, I'll just put that up, differential impact. So our interventions are going to land differently with different people. So for instance, I might say that, this is not my data. This is from someone else's. This is Yu Yong Kwok's study with children who have histories of violence and sexual abuse and other kinds of things. And they actually showed that if those children are given a mentor, that those children tend to, over time, do better on things like depression. The depression goes down. That's true for most abused children, but not for children who have had sexual violence in their past. It seems the intensity of an adult mentor runs the risk of actually making children more depressed, possibly because the sexual violence in their past makes them interpret the intervention in a different way. You can imagine why someone with sexual violence in the past might find a very intense relationship with an adult very threatening or triggering of their abuser. Whereas for a child who's experienced physical violence, it's less so the case. And of course, delinquency followed a very kind of different pattern with children who were sexually abused being less delinquent, but it was the children who had experienced neglect as being more delinquent. So all I'm trying to suggest here is this idea that there are different patterns to what we're understanding as resilience. And the other cautionary note is, as the science is emerging, and this is my latest work, is that there are limits to resilience, that we have this concept now of toxic positivity. I'm talking to positive psychologists, and suddenly we're, oh my gosh, we have to be cautionary here. There is that over-excessive belief in individual self-efficacy, that I can change everything. And of course, that's very dangerous. I recently heard the mayor of the town in Florida where a massive hurricane destroyed homes on the coastline because they're too close to the ocean. And this mayor was saying, oh, we are resilient because we are going to rebuild. We are going to recover. And of course, this is not resilience. Rebuilding your home during a period of climate change, after a major storm wipes it out, building it so close to the ocean is not resilience. It is stupidity. And therefore, what I'm going to argue is that our idea of resilience is that we cannot be caught up in this notion of overestimating our ability to cope, nor can we ignore the fact that as we cope, and this I know we are now looking at, we actually have studies, Dr. Deb and I, and along with other colleagues, we're actually, well, sorry?
Ashwini.
Ashwini. I was thinking of the last name, but it's Dr. Ashwini, are actually looking also at how these factors affect people and trying to understand in terms of with students or other populations, how they affect. But what we're understanding is this idea of even the stress of racism or social marginalization or class or caste or whatever, that all of these aspects of our resilience can get underneath our skin and wear at our ability to cope. So while coping is admirable, what we're also understanding now is that there's a need to be cautious as well. Overfunctioning can actually wear on us over time too. Some of those studies actually that did that came out of actually Stephen Hopfel's work in Palestine and in Israel, where there was this threat of constant bombardment. This was pre-October 7th, obviously before the most recent war. But what those studies were showing was that when you're in an ambiguous state of stress, it wears on your inner self. And things like racism and social marginalization and poverty and job loss and these other things have exactly the same impact. So resilience is a story of mindset and resources. It's a story of navigation and negotiation. It's a story of cautiously finding the right protective factors that respond to the risks we're experiencing to achieve the outcomes we want. And all of this is somewhat culturally determined. So on that note, I'm going to simply say thank you very much for listening. I hope it's inspired some thinking. And I, of course, look very much forward to working with Dr. Deb, continuing. We have projects going, et cetera, and it's always nice to reconnect with some of my colleagues in India. So with that note, I will stop there for a minute and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much for that very inspiring and very informative talk. There are a lot of questions I have, but I am going to
get to talk.
Audience's questions first. The first question is from Trisha. Trisha says, thank you for such an interesting presentation. You have explained the external factors beautifully, but I was wondering if there are attitudes like self-esteem, self-efficacy that contribute to resilience. That is one question. And the second is, are the two, that is internal and external factors, connected in any way?
I want to make sure that, what I wanted to do is just, we hear a lot about the internal factors. I did note that each of those, internality of self-efficacy, control, self-esteem, these are all predictors of resilience. Absolutely. My talk, though, yes, I've tried to help us as people in the positive psychology field to also understand that there's a connection, that that young woman I started with today, her self-esteem was caught up not just in her head, it's about what she's told by a society that says, what is your role as a woman? So until I could get her to see herself not as a subservient woman at home to this abusive man, but as the professional young woman that is told she has value in the workplace, it was only when that cognitive dissonance was shaken that I was able to get her to take the self-esteem that she had at the workplace and apply it to her personal life. So what I'm always trying to do is play a ping pong game or, you know, a badminton game with someone and say, what is the individual quality and what is the resource outside of you? And how do those sort of interact, if you will? So if I can, so for instance, I tell people, sometimes I meet people who want to exercise more. They want to be fit. Everyone wants, fit. And I say, okay, that's great. Change your mindset. Think about what your motivation is. And then think about changing your peer group. If you want to get someone to go to a gym every day and exercise or go to a yoga or a meditation class, you don't ask them to do it alone. You say, find a friend or a family member who will go with you to the gym. And then you have a social contract. You have the individual motivation, which is internal, but then you have the externality, the external cue saying, wait, I'm your friend and you said you were going to come with me every day to the gym and get fit. Now I'm reminding you, I'm a social catalyst. And what we're now seeing in this more multi-systemic models of resilience, we're understanding that we need the social and the psychological, the biological and the physical, the natural, et cetera, And the more systems that we can help people activate in their lives, the more likely the intervention is going to be sustainable. Because let's face it, we try and motivate people to get healthy, and they try for a day or two or a week or two, and then they stop. And largely that's because the other systems do not change with them. And this is now the emerging science of resilience. Please.
Thank you. I think that also answers her next question, where she had asked, what are the ways to strengthen the internal systems? So that is together with the external systems. Related to this, I have another question. In some families, organizations, and in some cultures as well, ruggedness is presented as desirable, and seeking help is presented as a sign of weakness. Because of this, the fairy godmother or the fairy godfather may be willing to offer support, but they have no clue that Cinderella needs support. So from your work across cultures and across contexts, can you share with us some cultural processes or traditions in any part of the world that are designed to encourage people to reach out for help?
That is such a great question. And you're absolutely right that there is a huge propensity in many cultural spaces, and sometimes it's based on gender lines, sometimes it's based on culture lines, whatever, for people to refuse to seek help. What I always find is, to tell you the truth, I find that there's a few strategies here to work with that. The first one, of course, is to understand where someone might find help in a way that they would accept the intervention and from whom that intervention could come. The second part of that is to say, what is the smallest help seeking, what is the smallest thing they need help with that is least threatening? What can you do that's the least intrusive? So
Foot in the door technique.
Very much a foot in the door. If I'm saying to someone has a severe alcohol problem and they're not going to go reach for help, but maybe there is a small, maybe they could not go to the bar or out drinking with their friends. They have one friend that they might find that could say, could you just ask your friend to call you on Friday night so you have a place to go? I'm not sure what the holiday is, but whatever that evening is that people go out to drink or something. In other words, is there something, before you go to the therapist, is there something maybe a little bit more familiar and closer to you that maybe might make that possible? I always go for a smaller ask. There's a lot of evidence that people will seek help in ways that make sense to them culturally. So is it through a spiritual leader? Is it less threatening to ask a spiritual leader at a local temple, that type of thing, for help, or church? Is it possible to ask an extended family member for a little bit? A grandparent often is less threatening. And I always say that, if you can get those people, sometimes they are bridges. They are the first step to then getting into a pattern of asking for help, that once the grandparent says, I'm trying to help, but this is getting a little bit more than I can handle, you really maybe want to go see, someone else. So I'm always kind of going incrementally with people in culturally appropriate ways. I'll give you a very small example. There was an interesting experiment in Canada where they were trying to get young fathers young men who had children in a relationship, but they weren't looking after their babies. The young women that they had gotten pregnant were looking after the children. And they were trying to figure out how to get these young men to have a value about helping their children. And these young men would never come to the public health offices and do training on parenting or anything like that. But what they did was they discovered that these young men like to go to the barber shop to get their hair cut and especially trimmed. So what they did was they trained the barbers. They worked with the barbers to be parenting coaches for the young men. And then as the young men came to their barber shop, the barbers were the ones that said to the young men, have you seen your baby? When was the last time you saw your baby? Oh, I bet you would be a good father. Have you tried doing that? And in other words, the barbers became the coaches rather than it being people like us who are professionals. It was we trained the barbers to do the work with the young men. Now, that might be outside of your scope of practice, but my point is thinking about people's social ecologies as rich in opportunities to help them to find the resources they need. And sometimes people will find it less threatening to choose one of those resources. And then those resources are like pathways to us who are more professional and more able to help them through more serious problems. It's not perfect, but it seems to be the pattern.
Thank you. That's helpful. That's interesting. The barber. We have time for, I think, just one question. This is a question on protective factors among older adults. Any work that you have done with older adults? What are your thoughts on how older adults may be supported by systems around us?
Wow. Well, again, I think this idea, less so my own work, but I know that if you look at, Jeste is Jeste is the last name. He's quite a famous researcher in this area. And what he'll say is that a positive attitude towards aging. You get up in the morning and your back hurts and you crawl out of bed, and a person who says, well, that's aging. Yeah, that's better than the alternative. Is going to have actually the same impact on their life as never having smoked cigarettes. In other words, a potential for 7 longer years of life. And I think the story of resilience is very much about our need for this idea that we need social connectivity as we age. We also need the stability of housing and safety and those kinds of things. And the two seem to work together. But certainly in terms of our resilience, and the more we are embedded in a social network, or if you prefer, Dan McAdams' ideas on developmental phases of our lives, the more that we enter a phase of what's called generativity, meaning that I'm not just in a relationship in which I'm sort of infantilized or treated like I'm incompetent, but actually I'm able to share my stories and my wisdom and my skill set with others through volunteer activities or something like that. When we have those social networks, positive identities, positive attitudes towards the future, in combination with some financial stability and networks of people living with us, we are much more likely in combination to actually be more resilient to the tragedies that come with aging, the health issues, and indeed even the losses of the people around us as our friends and colleagues eventually pass away. So it's those kinds of complex multiple system responses that seem to work best. Now, I'll pass it back to Dr. Deb.
Thank you so much. And thank you for such an interesting talk. It was very informative for all of us. And I think specifically for those working in the area of resilience. We hope to see you again soon, this time probably in person.
I would like that very much.
And thank you to the NPPA team for organizing the third international conference on positive psychology and bringing together so many experts in the field. Thank you, Naina, for this session. And thank you, Professor Kamlesh Singh.
Thank you so very much, Professor Ungar and Professor Deb, for giving us your time. It has been truly wonderful to have you with us. To everyone who tuned in for this session, thank you for being here with us, and we hope you continue to join us for the upcoming sessions.
Hello, everyone.